Start. So this is a pretty difficult daf, especially filling in. So we'll see what we can do. It might be points where I get stuck. So you guys will help me fill in the blanks. So we're starting on Kuf Yud Gimel on the base, which is 113b. And we're at the line that says Seir Mishnah. It's like 10 lines up. So the Mishnah was talking about different cases. In general, there's a prohibition to slaughter a sacrifice outside of the temple in Jerusalem. That's a general prohibition. There are certain cases that where you would be slaughtering a sacrifice outside of the temple that you're nevertheless exempt from that prohibition. So the Mishnah, at the beginning of the parak, goes through a lot of different cases, which we will now go through more in detail right now. So again, we're starting about 10 lines up, 113b. It says, by the two lines, it says Seir HaMishnalech. So this is referring to the Seir Mishnalech, is the goat that is sent L'Azazel when he's pushed off the cliff on Yom Kippur. That's what we're talking about over here. If a person would slaughter that korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash, he would not be obligated. He would not be over on that lav. So let's see. So Seir Mishnalech, V'Raminhu. We have a question. The Mishnah excluded Seir HaMishnalech based on a pasuk that it said El Pesach Ohel Moed Lo Hiviu. Don't, if meaning the verse says don't bring it to the tent, but he didn't bring it to the tent. He didn't bring it to the entrance of the tent. That verse seems to imply only things that are appropriate to be brought to the tent. So that's how the Mishnah excluded Seir HaMishnalech. Seir HaMishnalech, you don't bring to the tent, you bring it to Azazel over on the cliff. So the Gemara is about to ask a question that we're going to bring up Baraisa, another statement from the Tanaim that seems to suggest a different verse is excluding Seir HaMishnalech from the prohibition of slaughtering outside the temple. So it says Seir HaMishnalech V'Raminhu. I have a question. E korban shemea ani. So again, this is now a quote of the Baraisa. Sorry, O korban, or an offering. Shemea ani afilu kodshe bedek habayis. I would think even property of the temple, not necessarily things that you slaughter, but just property of the temple, shenikru korban, would be included in the prohibition of slaughtering outside. Shnemar v'nikrav es korban Hashem. Right, because it says you slaughter the korban Hashem. Talmud loymar ve'el Pesach ohel moed lo hiviu. He didn't bring it to the opening of the tent of meeting. Misha roy lavo ba'ol hamoed. So therefore, this prohibition is only referring to cases where it's fitting to be brought to the ohel moed, which excludes therefore general cases of bedek habayis, meaning in general, let's say the temple owns an animal that it's using for the upkeep of the temple, whatever that exactly entails. That is going to be excluded from the prohibition of slaughtering outside the temple, based on the verse of B'nikrav es korban of the El Pesach Ohel Moed Lo Hiviu. Okay. Yatsu Kachei Bedek Habayis She'ein Ra'uyin, that is not fitting. Otzias Elu She'ein Ra'uyin V'lo Otzias Seir HaMishnalech. So this takes out things that are not roy, things that are not fitting to be brought to the tent of meeting, but it did not exclude the case of the goat being sent to Azazel. It didn't exclude that. For that, we're going to need a different puzzle. Shehu roy lavo el pesach ohel moed, because Seir HaMishnalech is roy to come to the ohel moed. Talmud lomar la Hashem. Therefore, the pasuk says la Hashem, to Hashem. Lo hoitzi Seir HaMishnalech she'ein meyuchad Hashem. As much as Seir HaMishnalech, what this means is not meyuchad, is not solely for Hashem, whatever that means. Therefore, it's excluded from the prohibition of slaughtering outside the temple, because only things that are Lashem, fully for Hashem, are included in those things. Now, Seir HaMishnalech, this goat that's sent away, is not fully for Hashem, whatever that means. Okay, so the point for us is we have a contradiction to our Mishnah. On the one hand, the Mishnah said we're excluding Seir HaMishtaleach from the pasuk of El Pesach Oel Moed, right? That has to be fitting to come to the temple. But this brisa we just brought is excluding it from a verse that says Lashem, that has to be specifically for Hashem and not for anything else, whatever that means. Okay? So the Gemara answers, Kan Koidem Hagarla, Kan La'achar Hagarla. Yeah, it's okay. One verse is talking about a case where the lottery that determines which one's the Seir L'Azazel, that already happened, and the other verse is referring to a case where it didn't occur yet. One second. Yeah. So again, so we're using El Pesach Ohel Moed to exclude the case. I think of let me just make sure I'm right about this. Yeah. The Brisa, right, where we bring it from Lashem, that's referring to before the Goyal, before the lottery. Whereas in the Mishnah, it's referring to after the lottery, when it's already set aside as a Seir L'Azazel. So therefore, there's no contradiction. The Gemara asks now, Achar Hagarla, after the lottery, Nami, Ha'ika Vidoy. It's still fit to bring to the Oil Moed because there's the process of the Kohen doing the confession. So even after it gets the status of a Seir L'Azazel, it still is going to be brought to, still fitting to come to the Oil Moed because the Kohen Gadol, needs to do the confession, the Vidoy. Ella Amar Rav Mani Lokashia Kan Kodem Vidoy Kan La'achar Vidoy. Again, it's not a kasha. The verse that's mentioned of Lashem, the Baraisa, is referring to before Vidoy, and the verse that's referring to El Pesach Ohel Moed, that's not fitting to be brought to the Mishkan, it's not fitting to be brought to El Moed, that's after Vidoy. Okay, that's Seir HaMishtaleach. Now we're going to move on to a Roveah and a Nirva. So again, the Mishnah had stated in a separate clause, there are certain cases where where a korban is disqualified. One of those things is the case of a Roveah and Nirva, basically an animal that had one way or another sexual relations with a person. So an animal like that is unfit to be a korban, and therefore it's not going to be applicable to this prohibition of slaughtering outside. So let's see. Again, we're on the last line of page 113b. Harovea and a nirva, the animal that had relations with a human being. And for that, sorry, that's one more piece of background information. The Mishnah that lists it, brings it from a different pasuk. And if you look back to the Mishnah, it brought it from, how do we know that a Raveh and Nirva, you don't have the problem of shchutei chutz, of slaughtering outside the temple? Because it says, Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Since it says Lifnei Mishkan Hashem, we're only referring to things that are fitting to be brought to the Mishkan Hashem. Again, that's a different verse than the verse that we excluded, the Seir HaMishtaleach. That verse was coming from El Pesach Oel Moed. This is Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. So two verses. There's El Pesach Oel Moed, that we use to exclude the Seir HaMishtaleach. Now we're bringing a verse Lifnei Mishkan Hashem in front of the sanctuary of God. That verse is going to be used to exclude a Rovea and Nirvas, amongst others, which we're now going to busy ourselves with. Okay, so again, now we're starting, Jules, we're starting from we're already at the bottom of 113b. The two dots, it says Rovea v'Nirva. So now let's keep going. Harovea v'Nirva v'ha nami tepuk levi pesach olam moed. Why do you need to come onto the verse to exclude a Rovea and Nirva? Why do you have to come onto the verse of Lifnei Mishkan Hashem? Just bring it from the verse of El Pesach Olam Moed. Okay, so meaning, why did Mishnah have to bring a new verse to exclude this? They could have excluded it from the first verse. That's the question. So really, the Gemara says, Bish lama roveya v'nirva. In truth, the Gemara says, I understand the case of a roveya and a nirva, of the animal that had sexual relations with a person. Mishkachas le the akdishinhu meikar v'hadar rav. I have a case. I can find a case where even though the person dedicated it as an offering, nevertheless, if he'll now go and have relations with it, that would make it invalid. So I understand why we need a separate verse for this, because at one point it was valid. At one point it was valid, it only became invalid later. That's not the case with those in the first list. Those were never valid. Okay. So what does the Gemara not understand? Ella muktzah v'nevad. However, the cases where a person sets aside an animal as an idol, or he serves the animal, in both of those cases, ein adam oiser davar she'eino shaloi. A person cannot prohibit something that's not his. What does that mean? There's a rule in Shas that your item, when you own something, and I come and I do an action that would prohibit it. Say I'm not talking about me, but let's talk about in general. A person comes and he worships it as an idol. And as much as it doesn't belong to him, his idolatry doesn't have an effect on the animal because, hey, that's my animal. You can't go and just worship my animal and prohibit it from me. That's not fair. I know whatever the reason for that is, but that's the general idea. So when it comes to an offering is the property of the temple, right? You were makdish it, you consecrated it to the temple. Therefore, if you already made it an offering, it belongs to the temple. So if you would come then and do idolatry on the animal, that doesn't have effect on it. And you're not allowed to do it, obviously, but it won't prohibit the offering. Therefore, it'll never become prohibited in the first place. So what's the case where it starts off as being okay and then becomes invalid? Again, we have that case by the case of the nirva. We'll see why. The nirva is different. For some reason there, once you consecrate it and then a person goes and has relations with the carbon, nevertheless, it gets the status of a rovea or a nirva and is prohibited to bring it to carbon. But that's not true when it comes to idolatry. Even if a person serves the animal as an idol, once he was consecrated, it won't have that effect anymore. So therefore, we have a question: why do we need the second verse? Right, the verse of let's remind ourselves the verse that says "Lifnei Mishkan Hashem." Right, that's a separate verse from the first verse. Lifnei Mishkan Hashem. Why do we need that verse? We answered. The reason why we need it is in order to exclude cases where it was once fitting and then became invalid. Where it was once valid and then became invalid. So that makes sense by the case of the nirva, the rovea and the nirva. Because you consecrate it and it can still become invalid. But cases of idolatry, once you consecrate it, cannot become invalid. So therefore, we have a problem. So it answers the Gemara. We're on the fourth line. It says, "B'kodshim kalim." We're dealing in a case of light kedusha, of kodshim kalim. Again, there's different levels of kedusha. Kodshim. There's higher level hekdesh, higher level consecration. There's lower level consecration. Here we're dealing with a case of lower level consecration. The aliba de Rabbi Yossi Hagalili damar kodshim kalim mamun bailam hu, and we're going only according to Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi says even after I consecrate an animal as kodshim, it doesn't become the property of the temple. Kodshim would, but kalim, lighter level consecration, does not become property of the temple. Rather, it remains mamon bailim. It remains the property of the owner. And therefore, in as much as the property owner, if he will go and use it as an idol, or set it aside as an idol, he has the power to prohibit it. Okay. Hu detanya, this we know this based on a baraisa. Umale ma'al b'Hashem, he went against Hashem. L'rabos kachim kalim shehein mamono, that are his money. So we see from this, Divrei Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, we see from this that kachim kalim doesn't become the property of the temple, rather remains the property of the owner. Hilchak v'nirva davar erva. So Roveya and a nirva is very strict. So that could even be by kachim theoretically, because a Roveya nirva, if a person has relations with an animal, that's a very severe saying. It's a davar erva, and that almost just overrides the fact that it's ein adam oiser esheina shelo, that a person can't prohibit that which is not his. Since it's a davar erva, it's a matter of immorality. It's overrides that clause. Muktzah v'nevad avodas kochavim, but things that are set aside for avodah zarah or used as an idol, that's specifically by kachim kalim. That's going to be specifically by kachim kalim. That that we need to still remain in mamon bailim according to Rabbi Yossi. Okay, is everyone clear with that so far? We're about to get also sort of a separate point. Is everyone following so far?
Yeah. Good this end.
Sorry?
I said I'm good this end.
Great.
We're kind of following. Where are you exactly?
Yeah, where are you exactly?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Right now I'm on Kuf Yud Dalid, 114. I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines down on page 114. Do you need me to tell you that in the English part?
No, that I do. We should be able to find it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the word I'm on is called esnan. So again, we just basically said that the reason why we need 2 verses, and I keep having to go back to the Mishnah to remind myself what the verses are. But one verse was El Pesach Ohel Moed Lo Hibiu, to exclude things that are not fitting to be brought to the Pesach Ohel Moed. Another verse which says with name Mishkan Hashem, that's a separate verse which excludes Oveya, Nirva, and other things as well, which we'll now talk about. The reason why we need the second verse is to prohibit things that used to be valid, used to be fitting for a korban, and became invalid. That's what we're doing. So we said that a Roveh and a Nirva, a person can consecrate it, and since it's a matter of immorality, they'll have relations with the animal, it will now become an invalid korban. Whereas by idolatry, that won't be true by higher level consecration, kachim, that'll only be true by kalim, lower level, that we say, according to Rabbi Yossi, lower level consecration, you can still, that still basically belongs to the owner, so even a person who serves it would prohibit it. It is now an invalid korban, and therefore we found the case where it was at first puzzle, let me rephrase that, it was at first valid and became invalid. That's why we need the second verse. Okay, that's the summary of what we did until now. Now we're going to go into more of these cases that are being prohibited by the second, that are being excluded by the second verse, right? That they're not a problem of shchutei chutz, of slaughtering outside the temple. Now we're going to talk about an esnan, machir. So basically an esnan, to say what that is, an esnan is a gift that a person gives to a prostitute to pay for her services. Right? So let's say a person gives a prostitute a sheep or a goat or a cow or whatever. That thing is called an esnan and is an invalid animal to bring as a sacrifice. So an esnan, which is invalid, mechir, it's a similar idea. It's something that a person uses to exchange for a dog. Or he's buying a dog, so he gives the mechir, let's say it's an animal or whatever, he gives that in exchange for a dog. Kilayim, an animal that's mixed breed, even though both the parents may have been kosher as a korban, the mixed breed animal is not kosher for a korban. Yotze doifin, as well as an animal that was born through a C-section. All these different animals are invalid for a korban, and therefore you are not going to have the prohibition of slaughtering outside the temple. So we need to find a case where these animals did have a time that was valid to bring a korban, meaning it was consecrated, and then it had a time it was supposed to be a korban, and then became invalid. So we have to make an okipta. Basically, we have to establish this in a very particular case. Because again, we have the rule that a person can't prohibit something that's not his. So if a person takes something that's already hektish and uses it to pay the zayna, to pay a prostitute, that's not going to have any effect. So we have to be talking about the case. Again, this is a little complicated, so I don't know how much we want to go into it, but we're going to say this is talking about bivlados. Sorry, bivlados kachim. We're talking about a case, basically, again, let's see if I get this right. We're talking about a case where we had an animal that was pregnant. It was hektish. The animal was hektish. You go, or someone goes, and I think this is what happens. You promise the animal to a prostitute. So, sorry, the vlad, the fetus, you promise to a prostitute. The fetus is not yet kodshim really yet. But in as much as it was an uber, it was a fetus, it could have been brought to the temple because it was still in its mother's belly. So it had, in a sense, a time where it was a valid korban, in a sense, because it was a fetus of a valid korban. But you go and you offer it as payment to a prostitute. Again, it's not yet, we're going to see this in a second, it's not yet considered consecrated yet. The uber, the fetus is not yet considered sanctified yet. So because we say summer vlade kodshim b'haviyosan haviyosan hein kodshim. Sorry, kadoshim. What that means? Second. Vlade kodshim, the offspring of a consecrated animal, becomes consecrated only upon being born, but not before. Okay, Vlade kodshim b'haviyosan hin kadoshim. They only become offerings, they only become consecrated upon being born. Again, is everyone following this? This might be really good. This is confusing me to me too, so I'm not sure if I'm giving it over completely. Does everyone feel like they're following this case? You want me to repeat it? Do you want me to go on?
No, I'm good this side. I'm good over here.
Okay, great.
Where are we again?
Where are we now?
Yeah.
We're almost to we basically just reached the two dots on 114A. It's about a third of the way down.
Top of 114A2.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ross.
Okay, so basically we just found all these cases, a case where the animal had a time where it was valid. It was valid to bring as a korban, and then became invalid after having become a korban, essentially, after becoming consecrated, becoming a korban. And that, for that case, since it had a time where it was valid, that is a separate pasuk than what we used for the seir hamishtalech, the sent away goat. Okay. Fine. Now we're going to get involved in, going back to the Mishnah a little bit, we had a machlekes in the Mishnah about bali mumin and different types of animals that aren't currently valid but will become valid in the future. Okay, so according to Rabbanon, those animals that, in as much as they're not valid right now, there's no prohibition of slaughtering them outside the temple. There's no prohibition of slaughtering them outside the temple because they're not valid right now. That's according to Rabbanon. According to Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, in as much as they'll become valid for a korban in the future, there is a prohibition to slaughter them outside right now. That's the machlekes in the Mishnah. So let's now go into the Gemara. So it says bali mumin and osov es benoi. So it says basically three cases: a case of an animal that has a mum, a case of osov es benoi, basically where you're not allowed to slaughter an animal and its child on the same day. So again, so this is only a pasul, only something that makes the animal invalid for today. Tomorrow it'll be okay again. Bali mumin, again, some mumin can pass, some blemishes can pass, as well as a dove that's too young. And those are the cases that we're going to be talking about right now. And the Gemara is going to explain why do we need each case. So Bali mumin also as beno v'tzarichi. I need all three cases. Ditana Bali mumin. If you would have only taught me Bali mumin, you would have taught me the case of an animal with a blemish that has no prohibition of shchutei chutz. That's mishum dema'ise. That's because the animal with the mum is gross. It's gross. Aval torin. But when it comes to doves, the lo me'ise, ema de modu le Rabbi Shimon. Maybe they would agree to Rabbi Shimon that there would be this prohibition of slaughtering it outside the temple because it's not gross. We only said that it's exempt from that prohibition when it's gross. Therefore, we need to also state the case of the doves. Sorry, yeah, that's why I also need to say the case of the doves. Vitana Torah. Let's say we only would have taught the case of the doves. That's mishum de lo chazi. I would say that's because they were never valid, v'itchu, and they're still not valid. They'll only become valid in the future. They never had a time when they were valid. Aval bali mumin, they were once valid and they became invalid. Ema de mode lehu Rabbi Shimon l'Rabbanan. I would say in that case, the case of bali mumin, which were once valid, maybe I would say that Rabbi Shimon agrees to Rabbanan because at least it was once kosher. Therefore, we need to also teach this case of Bali Mumin to teach you that Rabbi Shimon holds of himself even there. Vitana Hanitarti. Let's right. And if we taught both these cases, Bali Mumin, animals with a blemish, as well as the case of the doves, I would say that's Mishum de Psula de Gufaihu. That's a psul, that's an invalidation in the animal's body. It's not old enough yet, or it has an invalid mum on it. Aval usuv as beno, but the prohibition of slaughtering a mother and a child on the same day, the psul me alma, see that psul, that invalidation comes from the outside. Ema module rabbanon Rabbi Shimon. I would say in that case that rabbanon agree to Rabbi Shimon that you would have the prohibition because it's not really a psul, it's not really an invalidation in the body of the animal. It's an invalidation that's coming from outside. Therefore, it's suricha. Okay, so we just basically said why we need these three different cases to tell us that we have the machlekes, the arguments between Rabban and Rabbi Shimon, even in these cases, because there'd be a reason each one of them why I think they wouldn't argue. Okay, so far so good. We're at almost about 3/4 of the way down, right after the two dots. Shahaya Rabbi Shimon Oimer. Okay, on still on 114a2. So again, so we have a disagreement between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan when you have an animal that will in the future become valid, not currently valid, but in the future become valid. Is there a prohibition of slaughtering outside of the temple? Okay. So my time with Rabbi Shimon, where does Rabbi Shimon get this from? Rabbi Yula. Amar Reish Lakish, the Amar Kral, the pasuk says, "Lo ta'asun kechol asher anachnu oisim po hayom." Don't do all the things that we do today. So this is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking, and he's telling the Jewish people that there's going to come a time that the Jewish people are going to enter into Israel, and for a certain part of the history, there's not going to be a set temple. There will be a Mishkan. So different Mishkans had different levels, but there were certain mishkan, certain sanctuaries that were pretty much on par with the temple, and certain ones that were on a lower level. And during that time in history, it was actually permitted to make what's called a bama. A bama is basically a privately owned mizbeach. Everyone assumes somewhat familiar with a bama. So Moshe Rabbeinu is telling them not to do all of the offerings that they used to do when they had a Mishkan in the desert, not to necessarily do them when they come into Eretz Yisrael. Again, it's a little vague what exactly he's saying, so let's analyze. Amar lahu Moshe liYisrael. So Moshe is saying to the Jewish people, Ki ayali so la'aretz, when you enter into the land of Israel, takrivu choivos, you can slaughter your obligations. Sorry, I misread that. Yesharos takrivu, you can slaughter things that are optional, but chovos lo takrivu. So you can only slaughter voluntary offerings. For instance, a shlamim, a toida. These things are voluntary, but you cannot slaughter obligatory offerings. Okay. The galgal. So again, at one point there was one of the places where the Mishkan was in Galgal. Yeah. So Galgal, Ligabe Shiloh, when the Mishkan was in Shiloh, was basically considered shchutei chutz. Sorry, one second. The Galgal Ligabe Shiloh mechusar zamanhu. So again, Shiloh had a higher level. That was a place where theoretically, you could bring obligatory offerings. But Galgal was not at that level. Galgal didn't have that same permanent status or the same level of holiness that Shiloh had. So Galgal is considered mechusar zman. Consider that it's premature. It hasn't yet reached that point where you're allowed to bring all different types of offerings there. V'ka'amar lehu Moshe lo tasun. So Moshe is saying to the Jewish people, don't do offerings there. Don't do obligatory offerings there. Okay. Amar Yirmiyah. So basically, we now have the source again because Rabbi Shimon holds that you're not allowed that even when the animal is not yet fitting, but it will become fitting in the future. He's saying there's a prohibition. So where do we see that from? We see that from the prohibition with respect to bringing obligatory offerings at Galgal. Because there, it was premature. So Rabbi Shimon says, oh, I see whenever you bring a premature korban, a premature offering, you're also going to have a prohibition. Okay? Is that clear? It's a little bit confusing. Is everyone clear with that?
Okay.
Okay, great. So right, so v'kamer lehu Moshe lo sasun, and so we see Moshe is telling us in this case when there's a mishkan at Galgal to nevertheless not do his offering. So we see it's premature. So says Rabbi Shimon, I learned from this that anytime there's a premature offering, there's a prohibition. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Yirmiyah says to Rabbi Zeira, Ihachi, that's true. Malki nami lilke. So you should get if that's true, that there's a prohibition to offer a premature offering, right? So then you should get that prohibition. You get malchus even in a case where you slaughtered it in the temple. Yeah. So alama amar Rabbi Zeira hakasuv nitku laseh. So why does Rabbi Shimon say that it's just a positive commandment prohibiting it? Right? Why is it not punishable by lashes the way it would have been in the times of Moshe to bring an obligatory offering? Okay. So say Hani Mili l'Rabbanon l'Rebbe Shimon. No, that statement of Rabbi Zeira is only according to the Rabbanon of Rabbi Shimon. and they hold anyway. There's no prohibition of offering things before their time. One second. But Rabbi Shimon, hachinami. But Rabbi Shimon, you will have this prohibition. Nami also. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar. So he's going to basically give a different answer over here. He's going to say a different answer as to why this question about Malchus, even getting Malchus inside the temple, is not a question. Yeah. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Panim de Gilgal, the going within the tabernacle, the Mishkan at Gilgal, Legabe Shiloh is Kechutz Dami. So the prohibition that we're getting from Moshe is really a prohibition of Shchutei Chutz, of slaughtering outside the temple. So therefore, that's why even nowadays, if you slaughter something early, but if you did it in the temple, you're not going to have this prohibition, because essentially it's a prohibition of slaughtering outside the temple. And that's why there's a prohibition. Okay, now we're going to get a different explanation as to where Rabbi Shimon gets his isser from. Again, Rabbi Shimon holds that once an animal has a potential that in the future will become valid in the future, there's a loisase, a negative commandment to slaughter outside the temple. So Rabbah is about to offer us a separate explanation of that. Rabbah Amar, time of the Rabbi Shimon, Kedetanya, Rabbi Shimon Oimer. It's as the following Bryce is going to tell us. Rabbi Shimon says, Minayin lezevach pesach bebamas yochid. B'shas iser habamois. How do we know that there's a prohibition? How do we know there's a prohibition to bring your pesach? Your pesach bebamas yochid. B'shas iser habamos shehu b'lo sase. Okay. How do we know that if you bring your Passover offering at your own personal altar at a time when altars are prohibited, that you get a prohibition? Talmud Lomar lo suchal l'zvoyach es haPesach. You are not able to slaughter the Pesach. So what's that referring to? Yachol af b'shas heter habamos. You might. Sorry, really, it's a suggestion. Yachol af b'shas heter habamos kain. You might think this is true, even when bamos, when these personal altars were permitted. Kain, you might think that that's true even there. Talmud Lomar be'echad b'sharecha. Lo amarti lecha. I only meant to say this. Ela b'shah shekol Yisrael nechnasin b'shar echad. This is only when the whole Jewish people go to one gate. Amos. So when is that? When do the whole Jewish people go to the one gate? Inema achar chatzois. So if you say that it's talking about after chatzois, when the Pesach is already, you're already able to offer the Pesach, right? It's after chatzois on Erev Pesach. Yeah, so kares nami mechayev. Then for slaughtering the Pesach offering outside the temple in Abama, you would be chayev kares. Elalav koidim chatzois. Rather, aren't we talking about koidim chatzois? We're talking about before chatzois. Yeah. Therefore, we have a prohibition against slaughtering a premature offering outside the temple. Again, because the Pesach is not yet ready. You're not allowed to offer the Passover offering yet. And we must be talking about a case before the time of the obligation to offer the Passover, to offer the Pesach. Okay. Yeah, everyone following so far? It's a little bit confusing with the Balma, what time period we're talking about. So, is anyone not following?
I'm sort of following.
Sort of following. Okay, so basically, again, we're getting a source for Rabbi Shimon. Again, Rabbi Shimon holds that there's a prohibition to slaughter an animal before it becomes valid, before it becomes a valid offering, since it'll become valid in the future. It's prohibited to offer such an animal outside the temple. So we're getting that from this case that it says you're not allowed to bring the Passover offering at a bama, at a personal mizbeach, personal altar. And we're saying that's because it's premature. That's dealing in a case where it's before the time to offer the Pesach offering, and therefore Rabbi Shimon sees a source from there that in general, if an animal is already premature, there's still this prohibition. Okay, that's the basic idea. So now the Gemara can reject this. Really, we're dealing in a case where it's already after Chatzos. We're actually going in a case where it's permissible to bring offerings on a bama. So now that's what I mean. The Brisa itself says we're dealing in a case where there is a prohibition of a personal altar. Yeah. Isser bama lo Isser bama lo for this type of offering, meaning for the Pesach. Right? But there's a heter b'ma l'chavero, heter bama for other types of offerings. So that's the case that we're talking about, and therefore Rabbi Shimon's not going to have a raya. He's not going to have a source from this case to a case of a premature offering, because we're really dealing in a case where it's already the time that you can offer a Pesach. Okay, fine. So now we're at 114b, about halfway down, a little more than halfway down. It says a mechusar zman. Okay, it says mechusar zman. Everyone there? So mechusar zman, again, we're talking about a case, basically. Different cases where, for whatever reason, either an animal's premature, the animal's not yet ready to be slaughtered, or a person may have a certain type of impurity, but because of that impurity, he's not yet ready to go and offer. So again, so it says mechusar zman. Now the list over here, again, this is a little bit complicated too. Our Mishnah has this case, but it seems like the Gemara didn't have the case of Mitzayra in its listing. And it says that you have to bring, there's a certain case where you have to bring an asham. So according to the Gemara's list, Mitzayra wasn't in the Mishnah. So when the Mishnah says you bring an asham, that seems to be not coherent. V'hani b'nei ashamas dinhu, these people that you listed, Azav, Azava, a lady that gave birth, these different types of cases, they're considered, they can become chayiv, obligated in an asham. Amar Zeiri, Tani Mitzayra b'hadayu. You have to say that we also taught Mitzayra in the Mishnah. Really, you have to amend the Mishnah and put Mitzayra in the Mishnah. Again, like I said, our Mishnah has it. The Gemara must have been dealing with a different girsa. That's the base I did. Okay, and again, basically, the Gemara is about to do a similar thing by Olo Sehen v'Shlomehen, Ola offerings and Shlomim peace offerings. And again, these cases, there's a case of Azav, Azava, etc. It seems right. So a Nazir brings these types of offerings, brings an Ola, brings a Shlomim. So it seems that the Gemara this is actually true. There's no mention of Nazir in the Mishnah, right? Nazir, a person takes a Nazirite oath. So at the end of it, he has to bring a certain karbanos, certain offerings. So again, Nazir is nowhere to be found. The Hani b'nei Shlomim ninhu, these people have to bring Shlomim, right? So the case of the Zav, the Zava, the Yoledes, all these different people, they're not obligated to bring a Shlom. So what are you talking about? Amar of Sheishes, Tani Nazir. Therefore, you have to amend the Mishnah and put Nazir in. That's what's going on. Because Nazir is the one who's obligated to bring a Shlomim. If you don't have Nazir in the Mishnah, that doesn't make any sense. Zeiri kavua tanai. The case of Zeiri, meaning this, that it says Mitzayra, that the Tanaim added to the Mishnah. That's why we have it in our Mishnah. The Rav Sheishes lo kavua tanai. But the case of Rav Sheishes, that the Tanaim didn't actually put in the Mishnah, but it's still we have to assume it's there basically. Okay. Okay, so the Mishnah had said that someone that brings an asham prematurely outside the temple is pater. He's not obligated. And asham is like a certain type of guilt offering. So the Gemara had said, the Mishnah had said that if you bring an asham prematurely, there's no problem of slaughtering outside. That's that you're not over on that issue. Okay, because it's invalid because it's premature. I'm Rav Chilkiya, Rav Tuvi, Lo Shanu Ella Lishmo. Aval Shelo Lishmo, you would be chayiv. So this case that we're saying that you're exempt when you bring an asham outside, that's only if you do it lishmo, but you do it for its own sake, right? And that since it's invalid, that's why you're exempt from offering outside. Aval shelo lishmo. But if you bring the offering not for its own sake, and therefore is actually, yes, valid, right? Because certain offerings, when you bring them not for their own sake, can still be valid as a shlomim. Therefore, you're going to be chayiv over here. Therefore, you're going to be obligated over here. So it comes out, even though it comes out an interesting thing. When you bring the asham for its own sake outside the temple, you're pater. But if you bring the asham not for its own sake, so it would be theoretically a valid shlomim, there you would be obligated for shchutichutz, for slaughtering outside. Hoil v'roi l'shelo lishmo bifnim. Since it's fitting to bring shelo lishmo inside, as much as it's fitting inside, when I do it outside, I'll also be obligated. I'll also have that prohibition. Sorry? Someone say something? No. Okay. Let's go. So Ihachi, where it says, if that's true, that when you bring it shelo lishmo, you're obligated. So therefore, lishmo, when you do it for its own sake, you bring it for the sake of an asham, nami nechayev. Let it also be obligated when you bring it lishmo. In as much as there's potential hoil v'roi lishelo lishmo bifnim, since it is theoretically fit. Once it's theoretically fit, right? Because you could bring it as a shelo lishmo korban, bring it as a not for its own sake asham. Therefore, even when I bring it for its own sake outside the temple, I should have the prohibition. Says Amar, no, boy akira, no, because it's in as much as you didn't have a specific intent to offer it shelo lishmo, it retains its status as an asham, and an asham here has no validity inside the temple. Would have no validity prematurely. Therefore, that you're only going to have this obligation of when you offer it shelo lishmo, and therefore it would be a valid shlom outside. Okay, everyone's good with this so far. I know this is also like very confusing. Shelo lishmo, everything. Is everyone clear? Okay, I'll assume everyone's okay. Fine. Maskef la Rav Huna. So Rav Huna asks a kasha. The key yesh l'chadavar. Do you ever have such a case? She'eno kasher lishmo v'kasher shelo lishmo. Right, we're saying this asham. If you bring this asham shelo lishmo, it's permitted. But if you bring the asham, sorry, again, let me just rephrase that. And asham in general, even if you bring it shelo lishmo, will still be valid. It'll be valid as a shlomim. So here, what's happening though? The asham is premature, so it's invalid if you bring it as an asham. So the shmo is invalid. But shelo lishmo, if you bring the asham not for its own sake, so now it's a shlomim, yeah, there it's coming out an interesting thing. Rav Huna's bothered. Look, when you do it lishmo, it's nothing. It's invalid. So when I do it shelo lishmo, somehow that's going to make it better. That seems to be very surprising. Yeah. So do you ever have such a case like that where it's invalid lishmo, but it'll be valid theoretically. Shalol lishmo. When do you ever have such a thing? Says the Gemara back below. What do you mean? Of course we have cases like that. The hooray, turning the page. We have a Pesach b'shar Yomis Hashanah. A Pesach offering during other times of the year, meaning not on Pesach, prior to Chatzos on Erev Pesach. De'enu kasher lishmo. You can't bring the Pesach for its own sake before the time. Nevertheless, if you bring it shelo lishmo, it will be a valid offering. Yeah. The kasher shelo lishmo. Yeah. It would be valid shelo lishmo. So I have a perfect case. I have a perfect case where it's valid shelo lishmo, but not valid lishmo, the Pesach. So therefore, I'll also say the same thing by Asham. Gemara responds, Pesach b'shar Yemos Hashanah shlomim minhu. A Pesach during the rest of the year is more essentially a shlomim than an Asham is. So even though you do the Pesach shelo lishmo, meaning when you do the Pesach shelo lishmo, since it's anyway a shlomim, you will have brought a shlomim. It won't be a Pesach, but it'll be a shlomim. That's not the case by an Asham. An Asham is not a shlomim, I guess. Okay, that seems to be what's going on. I'm going to leave it here. We're on Kuf Tes Vav, 115a. And we are, how many lines down? We're at the third line, Lema Misayele. Okay, so that's where we are. Everyone have a wonderful day. Does anyone have any questions before flying off?
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hope you feel better.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.